So, hello, my name is Kieran Walshe, Munster Express. I'd be editor, director, and main shareholder. And the Munster Express started in 1860 and was by the Fisher family. They were an Anglo-Irish family who were of the liberal tradition, and they continued the paper well into the early 1900s. The reason for starting the paper, I think they were involved in the Home Rule party, Irish Parliamentary Party. Isaac Butt had been an MP for Youghal, and they were based down there. So they decided to come up to Waterford and set up a paper, and they had the Munster Express plus a few other ones. And there was a focus on farming at that time, and the country was in a bit of economic recovery. We have it all in a book, Waterford Memories, about how it all started and how the times in the 1860s were better compared to the famine decades. And they also got involved in, the editor at the time, the second editor, got involved in land agitation and actually went to jail for a couple of days for contempt of court for articles he published about a meeting in Stradbally. So that was condemnatory of issues relating to the land war. So he spent a few days up there apparently and got well fed, he got meals dropped into him, lots of visitors and all the rest. So might be a little different today if you're in jail. But anyway, it created a bit of notoriety perhaps and got a lot of publicity for the paper. So there were many papers in Waterford in those times. In fact, at the turn of the century, there was over 5 papers at one point, and it consolidated down to 3. There was the Waterford News and the Waterford Star. They became Waterford News and Star, then the Waterford Standard and the Munster Express. My grandfather bought the newspaper in 1907, and they moved from their base then in New Street down to the Quays, where there was a Waterford Citizen paper, and he consolidated the two into one, Waterford Citizen and the Munster Express, which gave a city and a county readership. And so they continued along. My grandfather was a councillor as well for the Redmond Party at the time, the Irish Parliamentary Party as it was called. And so it was a big deal at the time up to 1914. The Home Rule agitation was a big thing at the time. My father, he was in the Scouts and was in the Fianna, which was kind of a Republican thing. So anyway, he was in that end of it for a little while as a youth. And the War of Independence started. Waterford was fairly quiet. There was more stuff going on in the county than in the city, and in Tramore, but more in the west of the county and in Dungarvan area. The Civil War was a big event here because the nationalist, the Free State forces were coming out of Dublin. Waterford had been occupied by the Republicans, by the anti-treaty forces, and they occupied this building for about 3 or 4 days. And they, but uniquely enough, the families used to live over their businesses then. So my father was around 16, 17 at the time, he was still at school. And the grandfather said to them, look, we'll cooperate with these guys, we'll give them food and help them out and all the rest. And if we cooperate with them, they won't wreck the place. And it seemed to work out anyway, because nothing was very little damage. So for 2 days, family lived here. The men came in to work, did the printing and all the rest, kept on with their jobs, and the lads were here with guns. It was kind of crazy, you know. Well, small pistols. They were poorly armed, as it turned out. Again, it's in the book Waterford Memories. But they were on the premises, and suddenly then the Free State forces started getting closer, and it was kind of there was a few shootings were happening, and there was 2 men shot outside here on Hanover Street. At that point, everybody said, "Look, we all have to stop now. It's getting too dangerous." So the workers went home. The family decided to relocate to Tramore, but they thought, well, look, hold on, there could be looting in the city or something, so it might be better to stay close by. Might be able to appeal to people not to loot, to rob the place. So that didn't happen anyway. So when the grandfather left, they were advised to kind of, look, they're going to be overpowered by stronger forces. It might be better to try and escape, and suggested going out to Fenner or Dunhill or something like that. They eventually did. And so the anti-treaty force had big artillery and stuff, and they they fired lots of shells, and they took over the city fairly easily. And because the men here, they didn't even have proper rifles. In fact, we have some bullet holes upstairs here from the Civil War, from shots fired from across the river, because they were firing pistols from here and stuff. So anyway, so it's quite a tale. And when the story, when the siege was over, there was a big story to write, of course, and so that was written up, and there was a big demand in the paper that week. So you tried to print as many as you could, and my father was tasked with the journey to go to Carrick-on-Suir, which is across the Civil War lines. To kind of they hadn't invaded Carrick yet, the treaty forces. That was still under occupation by the anti-treaty people. But he managed to get around them. There was a sentry there you had to go by, and he got up there with the paper. So the people of Carrick were able to read it, the Munster Express, that the siege of Waterford had ended and the Free State had taken over, and that was in an anti-treaty town at the time, controlled town at the time. So he came back then and collected copy from the correspondence in Carrick and in Mooncoin, and back on his bike. That was all done by bicycle. So there you go. That's a story and a half, isn't it? And so that's one of the famous stories of the paper in that period. Subsequent to that, the country went into a kind of an economic decline, and it was very hard to do business from the late 20s to the 30s. Although what did happen in the 1920s was Waterford got electrified, and my grandfather was big involved in trying to encourage that, and there was much publicity as possible to get the city electrified. Prior to that, it was on gas, so machines and lights were all on gas. So anyway, this is one of the first businesses to be electrified in the mid-20s, and so that was one of the big things in development. The 30s were difficult with the economic war and the stopping of payments for land purchase to England. 1938 then was a difficult period, and the Munster Express was sort of, we were worried. Grandfather was worried and my father was worried that there'd be a war in Europe, so they stocked up in paper and they bought as much newsprint as possible to cover them through the war years. So that was stored up in the store up in here in Thomas Hill. So, as it turned out, the newspaper prices quadrupled in that period, and we had enough here to even supply other papers at the time. So we got through the war years, but after that things got good here then. The 50s were good in Waterford, and 60s, well, began to industrialise. And there was a bit of prosperity then afterwards, so the paper expanded well, extra machinery was added, the black and white pictures started coming in, that we made our own ones, and we got our own press. This was an old printing thing here, but we had our own press, and sort of up until, I suppose, the mid-2000s, the papers were just expanded in pagination and advertising and circulation. It was going very successfully. So that's a bit of background here. That's a very brief synopsis. So within that period, we probably have certain timelines, maybe in the late 60s, early 70s, we're probably one of the first papers to have an entertainment page where we cover the show bands. And a couple of lads here, the Comerfords, Johnny O'Connor, they were musicians, and Mickey Dower, and they used to do the entertainment pages. So we were big into the arts, and the theatre was very important as well, all through the post-war era. So the Theatre Royal, we used to regularly cover stuff there in the cinemas. They were a big, the paper was where you had to go and find out what was going on, and the reviews of the plays were very important as well. And so we had a good relationship with the arts community, I suppose. Then one thing that happened, I suppose, is in the 60s, television started, and people thought that the papers would do badly, that we'd lose. And we did lose advertising, consumer advertising, like toothpaste and washing powder and soaps and stuff that went on television and was lost to the paper. But other advertisers came along, and the local business started expanding, and local industry was doing well, and there was plenty of employment in Waterford back then. So that's a bit. Of course, the glass factory was a great boost for the city. From the 50s onwards, it was a huge boost. So Waterford was one of the better off towns in Ireland, really. It's hard to think that today because it's not on its best. It's not in its best place. But back then, I suppose, from the 60s and 70s, after Dublin, Waterford, and maybe Cork, Waterford would have been the next best off place in the country. So that's something to think about. Maybe it'll come back again. Well, it's on the way, perhaps, So we got to be positive and hopeful.
And was that whole kind of based very much off the industry?
Yeah, I suppose the glass factory had it. They reckoned, I remember I used to work in Dublin, they did work with the Irish press. They reckoned they were the second highest incomes in Ireland, and the glass factory would have been one of the principal reasons, which had a spin-off effect amongst other employers. I suppose they had to pay more, because otherwise everybody would be working in the glass factory, you know. And people I went to school with, a lot of people went there rather than maybe go on to university. It was a better living to be made. Or, well, they couldn't, it was hard to get, it was expensive to get to university back then, but it was easier to make a decent living out of the glass factory. So that was the 70s period, I suppose, and even the 60s before then. It was a coveted job, and there was there was plenty of industry here. So they were good times. And even the 80s, I suppose, other areas were hard hit. Glass factory and some other factories are doing okay in the 80s, but some of the traditional industries fell in the post join the EU. The jute factory closed, and some of the textiles companies closed, and involved in clothes and textiles were difficult. But engineering, and then other American companies came in. There was Crumb and Schubert, employed 1,000 people at one point. Bosch and Rom still with us; they employed a lot. So there are many. We've still got Hasbro. They employed 500-600 at one point. So we had many big factories here, and it was a hub of enterprise and industry. Waterford was.
What kind of era would you have grown up in?
I grew up. I left school in 1975, so I went to school in Waterford. I used to commute in from Tramore, so that was my period, I suppose. It's time when the Waterford soccer team were really doing well. I'll give you little pull out there when they got into the cup final and won the cup. There was a big era for the football, was big, late 60s, early 70s. So it was a great era, really. I remember the Manchester United and the Celtic matches in the European Cup. It's hard to think now that an Irish team they can't get into the Champions League now to beat the big teams. But back then you could if you came out with a draw. So the hurlers weren't doing as well as they are today. But that was my era, and I suppose the music era was good as well, you know. There was plenty going on in that scene. And then I went to live in the UK then from the late 70s to the early 80s, yeah.
And would your father have told you any stories about when he was coming up 3 years in Waterford?
Yeah, well, I suppose he can tell me stories back in the 20s when people went to school. Like, as said, my grandfather was a politician, and he used to go canvassing around the houses. And there were kids there who were barefoot. He remembers them. In the areas like New Street, there were kind of tenements and they were barefoot. And he praised De Valera. He wouldn't have been a great fan of him, De Valera, but he brought in a boot and shoe allowance apparently in the 1930s. And they had a leather factory. They were making boots and shoes then, and so everybody who wasn't able to afford shoes was able to get shoes on the courtesy of the state. So they were hard. He told me stories like that you'd never forget. And I suppose nutrition wise, people. It wasn't that bad. I suppose during the war years, people were better off here. There was a bit of ration of tea and sugar, but people were fairly well fed compared to other countries. But there was a lot of unemployment. I think he thought the 30s were terrible, and the economic war, what was done then, held the country back. I suppose there are a lot of lost decades from the 20s up to the 50s. That was one of his points, really. And we were better off working with America and England and not to try and go on our own. And we subsequently did that, but the idea of ourselves alone was not, it wasn't his idea. He wouldn't have gone with it, because he just thinks it held people back, we couldn't live just off agriculture really. So he had an outward view in life.
And can you, if not in your time, but also through recollections, can you recall any of the characters around the city?
Well, there was the Buddy man was one man anyway, up in the Major Cunningham. And they were bloody man. They were kind of politicians. Major Cunningham got a VC in the Second World War in Normandy. The Buddy man was a big character. People around the Marts, they were always great characters. The Ballybricken people. There were plenty of family names. The Quinlans. There were lots of great characters, and and people from the theatre. Well, Mick Brown now would be our theatre correspondent, and he would have been one of his best friends and characters. Yeah.
Who would the Buddy man have been?
His name was Power, and he was a mayor. I think he featured in a Ballybricken film there not long ago. Yeah, his grandson now was friendly with. He was they had a Manor garage service station. So yeah, but he was an independent councillor. There were a lot of independent councillors back in those times, and they were quite gregarious and unusual. Not sure how all the politics worked, but between them and the main parties. But there was quite a motley collection at the time.
And would you be aware of any of the kind of social history that would have been in around the city centre area of Waterford?
Yeah, well, I suppose people in the city centre, well, I'm talking say the people in business or along the quays, there was a lot of people. No, people couldn't afford to be living out in Newtown or out in Tramore and places. They didn't have, not as many people had cars, and so people lived over their businesses a lot. So there was no out of town suburbs for shopping and stuff. So there was a lot of vitality, I suppose, and there were a few markets. There was the mart up in Ballybricken was a hive of activity in mart days. A lot of smells, I suppose, and a bit unhygienic. I think it got cleaned up in the 70s, but that would have been a big thing. A lot of pubs along the quays. The port was busy before it moved out to Bellevue, so there was a lot of portal activity, a lot of ships coming and going. And there was a passenger ferry to Fishguard from Adelphi Quay until the 60s. It was the Great Western, they used to call it. So I was never on it, but it wasn't a very comfortable ship. But the people went to Rosslare after it, so they were things that were happening. Yeah, there was no motorway to Dublin. The journey to Dublin was 3 hours. It was slow. And he used to tell me that back in the war times, you couldn't have any petrol, and you'd have to. The only people that had petrol were priests and doctors. Yeah, so because they'd be looking after the sick people, and the trains going to Dublin they used to use turf. They ran out of coal, so it used to be 4.5 hours on a train going to Dublin. So stories like that he used to say, all right. And also he was brought up to after the 1916 rebellion. My grandfather took him along to see the destruction up in Dublin. A week later, when it was all over, they went up by train to have a look around. And he never forgot that. Yeah. So there's some stories. That's yeah.
And
about you're talking about social history in the town.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I suppose there was a lot of emigration in the 50s. An awful lot of emigration. So there was during the war years, a lot of people had to leave as well. So it wasn't doing well. There were large families and they were living in small housing, up in in the lanes and stuff, and there were slum dwellings. So I suppose it's improved a lot since, but yeah, it was tough. It wasn't easy.
And would you have had messenger boys?
Yeah. Oh, we did. Yeah, I actually did it for a summer once myself. Believe it or not, I did it. You do newspaper deliveries, run around. There'd be a lot. I did it for a summer when I was 15. So you would have had a fella on a bike going around and delivering bits and pieces and picking up messages and stuff. Melting metal. There was a time of hot metal in newspapers, so that was another task. Going around with the van, delivering the papers to the shops, doing the rubbish, getting tea for the lads who are working, and blaz. That was another task. Cleaning up a little bit. That's generally running around a bit.
That would be the same role going back generations.
I guess so. Yeah, there would have been a kind of then you'd have a copy boy or a messenger boy. But I say loads of businesses had a messenger boy. Say a guy to run around, do a little errand, and on a bike, and they whatever, it was a fairly minimum wage at the time, but you wouldn't rear a family on it. But I suppose it gave them the sense of work and duty and attitude, and usually get on to do better things subsequently, get a factory job maybe after or something.
There's always a starting out.
It's a starting out thing, yeah. It's just a young lad just leaving school, yeah. Like a lot of people left school at 14 and 15 back then, to go for an apprenticeship or, that'd be the thing, yeah. But there was, I guess, a lot of family connections were needed to get decent jobs back in those times. That was one of the things. There was a lot of people then, labourers, it was hard. Times were tough. Therefore, there was a lot of emigration, I think, because opportunities were limited in the area back in those times. Before the factories started expanding, then things got better.
And you have the premises up Thomas Hill there as well?
It's used out for there's a kind of an enterprise scheme with City Council, and they they're using it at the moment as an old warehouse, yeah.
But what would that have been?
It would have been a paper store. So they're using it now for, it's kind of, Waterford makes it sort of a, lads starting off, to sort of, it could be artists, it could be people trying to make new products. So it's a little small.
I think Sens is up there.
Yeah, sorry?
I think Southeast Makerspace is
Yeah,
up there.
that's it, yeah. So they're doing a little bit there, yeah, so that's, I suppose it's a little help to the community, yeah. And it's in the city centre, which is kind of good too, have activity, I suppose today you could do a lot more. The city centre is kind of being a bit slightly neglected in places and needs more footfall and more activity, and small little enterprises starting off would be helpful, to getting people, instead of being out in an industrial estate in a little garage, it would be nicer if they were in the town, and more interaction then at times as well, So to generate more activity here. And what's new now, I suppose, there's a lot of immigrants in the town now that weren't there before, but they can be very enterprising and come up with new ideas and new little shops and new little businesses. You'd be surprised. We have beside us now, we have a Palestinian hairdresser, we've got an Algerian barber, and we have an acupuncturist. So there's quite a bit of diversity here. He's from Dublin, but he trained in China, so a fair bit of a diversity here, and then little office supplies business. So so it's the city centre has changed a lot. I suppose it's maybe for more special businesses, because the supermarkets are so strong now. It's hard for small grocery stores that would have been here in the past. You would have had them a lot along the quays here. Now it's like one or two centras and stuff. So maybe some specialist shops and somebody doing something a little different. There would have been a lot of hardware stores on the quay. You had Johnny Hearn's, you had Harper's just down the road here. They would have been they're on the same block. That was a huge ironmonger's place. I think it might be where Waterford Design Centre was now.
What was Harper's like to go into?
Oh, it was like Johnny Hearn's really. It was like a hardware store. A bit like, say, Morris's today or Woody's. You'd buy anything in there for building purposes. So if you had nails or hammers or this and that, or bits of wood, tools, various items. What else then? Yeah, of course Shaw's was there. You had Hearns on the quay, where the Granville would be now, and George's Court. That was a huge premises, and that was I'm sure other people you've interviewed tell you all about Hearns department store.
You mentioned, but not.
Yeah.
No one's really gone in depth on.
They used to have these little bells. As a kid now, it's because it closed in the 70s. As a kid, I used to remember they'd send the dockets to the head. There used to be a head area, like a train. It was like one of these things you see in the train station, where someone in a box directing traffic on the top. So there's wires going in, and there's the shopkeeper in one department might be doing dresses, another person might be doing fabrics, clothes, shirts, and the transactions would all be done there. They'd send the docket up to the HQ, and with the bit of money, and then they change, you come back. It's quite amazing to watch. You go in there as a kid. It was just amazing just to see these bells, dockets and bells, sort of round things going up and down lines. I don't know if you saw the thing Mr. Selfridge on television there. It might be a little like that today, a bit like that. So that was a busy place. There was a lot of labour involved in those department stores compared to today, and they had a lot of expertise. Now you have to kind of wander in. You hope someone knows a bit what you're looking for. But they were really expert, and they were well-trained people.
Brilliant.
The Rundle Square, well, you didn't have a city square then. There was kind of used to sell fish, and there's a bit of a market there at times. Again, I was just a teenager then when that was kind of began to stop, but there was a bit of activity there. And John Roberts Square, but there was no pedestrianisation. It was driving everywhere, weren't as many cars. But that was it. There were a lot of pubs around there. It was busy, but as late teens, there was Egan's, you had T&H was very, very busy. There was the Old Ground. The nightlife was busy there. It wasn't really down John Street, just around that area. And O'Connell Street had some. There used to be the Stone Court as a disco. It became the Roxy. Then you had Breen's, Tracy's was where a lot of big bands played, and the Showboat. U2 played in the Showboat. Now, I didn't get to see them, but anyway, they did play there. So that's a bit about the entertainment. This is a bigger hub than back then.
That's very good. Is there anything we've overlooked now? We covered.
I don't think so.
Is there anything else we're meant to cover? Or we ticked all our boxes?
I've given you a wide amount of stuff there, have I?
Yeah, you have. Yeah.
I'm just trying to think myself now.
I'm sure, like, you might want to come back and think, because I might say things that you might want to talk to someone else about. Because June Dara would have a lot of information about all of it, just those points about the entertainment. Because she was in the middle of it, and she'd be older, and she'd know all that stuff. I guess the hotels did really well out at Glass Factory, and they expanded too. You had the Ardree Hotel up in the hill there. You had the tower expanded. Wasn't much. There was an old hotel there. They bought sites there and expanded a lot. And the Granville wasn't there up to the 70s. It wasn't there. So the hotels expanded a lot here. And Dooley's was here, of course. And then Tracy's was Breen's. Tracy's used to be, that had a big, almost a supermarket, a huge butcher's, a sawdust on the floor at the back end, and then a hotel at the front end. And they owned the Savoy Cinema. And they owned a lot of it. They were probably the most powerful business family in town. Yeah. They owned a lot now. And then Tony Breen had another part of the family had the Ardree. So they were doing a lot here. So it was interesting things going on, all right. So there you go.
You mentioned the bullet holes. Are they visible inside? Or
inside. Yeah, I can give you a look now if you want.
Yeah, if I get.
Okay, yeah.